During the long, hot summer of 1914, the old order in Europe seemed firmly established. Europe's monarchs were confident, proud, and closely linked by marriage and descent. Tsar Nicholas of Russia was the King of England's first cousin. The Emperor of Germany was Queen Victoria's grandson and shared the King of England's carriage on many occasions. All this emphasized the pan-European inheritance and awareness of a common civilization that was also symbolized by the Entente Cordiale between the two old enemies, England and France. In 1914, Europeans commanded a culture that had spread throughout the globe. European civilization dominated the world, and Europeans expected it to go on doing so. But Europe itself was far from united. Britain and France were the dominant imperial powers, and Germany and Italy were eager to overtake them. The rest of Europe was a patchwork quilt of quarrels and national jealousies. Germany was the success story of modern Europe. Its population doubled between 1870 and 1914, and by 1914 its production of iron and steel was greater than that of the rest of Europe. Germany felt it was justified in flexing its muscles and reaching out for empire, and it rearmed prodigiously between 1889 and 1914. By 1914 it had a formidable army, 15 times the size of Britain's, and the most powerful artillery in Europe. Since 1897 it had also created a great navy. By 1912 the Germans possessed 20 modern battleships, compared with the dominant naval power, Britain, which had 30 dreadnoughts in European waters. Britain found Germany's naval build-up very threatening. In the summer of 1914, after years of tension, George V presided over the mobilization of the British fleet. Britain's allies, France and Russia, also mobilized against Germany and Austria-Hungary, the Central Powers. The Germans seized the pretext of Austria's quarrel with the Serbians to march into action against Russia and France. When the great powers honored their treaty obligations and paper commitments, the inconceivable happened. The whole of Europe was drawn into conflict. Enthusiastically and with eager expectations, the civilized world threw itself into war. The Germans' first move took the British and the French by surprise. A massive sweep through Belgium, bypassing Holland. Belgian resistance was overwhelmed, and the German advance became a procession. It brought German forces swiftly, as planned, onto the unprotected northern flank of the French, within reach of Paris. Across the Channel, the British Expeditionary Force was starting to embark. It was very small, but well trained and equipped. The mood was buoyant. In Paris, anti-German feeling ran riot. German shops were looted and plundered, and the French public was regaled with horror stories about German atrocities in Belgium. Paris was in danger, and all the taxes were requisitioned to take troops forward to the Marne. Everybody expected it to be a war of movement, a war fought at the gallop, dominated by cavalry. Both the generals and the private soldiers underestimated the force of modern artillery and the importance of new weapons and tactics. In the early battles of the First World War, both sides threw all their troops forward into the crucible. The small British standing army was decimated almost at once. The casualties were frightening. Hundreds of thousands of men died in the first encounters. This was the war that tore the heart out of European youth. The first German rush into France took them to the Marne and nearly to Paris. Then the French counterattacked, and the Germans were pushed back and forced onto the defensive. 1914 ended with much of northern France and Belgium under German control. During the 19th century, the object of warfare was to outflank an opponent, using the cavalry charge to win ground and change direction quickly. In 1914, in the first major European war for more than 40 years, cavalry could do nothing against accurate long-range rifle fire and the machine gun. The machine gun had finally become a reliable and reasonably accurate weapon. Machine guns and light artillery cut advancing troops to pieces. The Germans discovered a new weapon, the spade, almost by accident. Once they dug in, they were able to shoot down Allied attacks with ease. The British and French hurled men forward against thick barbed wire and deep German trenches. Artillery was not yet accurate enough to cut the wire or to penetrate the elaborate underground shelters which the Germans built. The major early battles of the First World War occurred as the Allies attempted to stop the spectacular initial German thrust. When the Germans were held and pushed back, they began to dig in, and then each side felt for the flank of its enemy until the line of trenches stretched from the Channel to Switzerland. After the Battle of Ypres in the autumn of 1914, both sides recognized that neither could outflank the other. Ypres had been the center of Flemish civilization and one of Europe's finest medieval towns. It became the gateway to the trenches. The British war poet Siegfried Sassoon wrote, "Who will remember, passing through this gate, the unheroic dead who fed the guns?" Patriotism, both in Britain and Germany, was fueled by violent propaganda. Young men were encouraged to fight for king and country, if necessary by being offered the white feather, a symbol of cowardice. Initially, conscription was not necessary in Britain. Only volunteers were taken for the trenches. But that didn't last long, and conscription for all men over 18 was introduced in early 1916. On both sides, all the resources of the state were mobilized for total war. It was a truly international war. Germany's allies included Austria-Hungary and Turkey, and Russians fought in the trenches in France against the Germans. The civilian populations were also organized, with gas masks, ration cards, and national saving certificates. The women of Britain played their part. They spurred on the reluctant heroes. They tended and comforted the wounded. But also, as the war went on, they became active members of the working population, replacing men on the farm, in the munitions factories, and elsewhere. Every woman who worked released more cannon fodder for the hungry trenches, and the participation of women in the war, even in Russia, transformed their status. It certainly helped towards their eventual emancipation in Britain. On the Eastern Front, Russia's early success was followed by a German counter-offensive which led to a crushing Russian defeat. In 1915, a further German offensive led to the conquest of much of Poland. During 1916, the Russians counterattacked and gained some ground. But the war in the East was a different type of war. Trench warfare was the exception and not the rule. It was a mobile, fast-moving war at which the Germans excelled. After 1916, the Russians just managed to hold their ground. In Flanders, the front-line trenches were in place by the end of 1914. Behind the front line, a host of communications trenches, reserve trenches, and hospital trenches were dug and defended. These were immensely powerful defensive structures, and they could not be breached by infantry attacks. The main result of the repeated battles in Flanders was to people no man's land with corpses. That part of northern France is still littered with the mechanical and human debris of the First World War. You can't dig a ditch without finding a reminder of the many men who died. At the Battle of the Somme, on the first day, 60,000 British troops were killed or maimed. 350,000 French troops and 300,000 Germans died in the various battles for Verdun. More than 8 million dead and missing, including civilians, in just 4 years. Between 1915 and 1917, neither side managed to make any significant impression or gain any ground. The generals, the soldiers and the civilians were equally at a loss. The battlefield was a wasteland. In the east, the Germans kept up pressure on the Russians, undeterred even by the Russian winter. Russian enthusiasm for the war dwindled. 3 years fighting on Russian soil led to hardship in the war zones and massive shortages in the cities. Soon there were bread riots and sustained political confusion. Tsar Nicholas ordered his troops to suppress the riots and re-establish his authority. But in March 1917, the time came when even crack troops would not fire on the rioters and refused point blank to accept orders from their absolute monarch. Senior army officers linked up with liberal politicians like Kerensky to take over the government. But neither Kerensky nor anybody else could placate the soldiers, and between March and October 1917, there were bread riots and mutinies in many cities. The Tsar had abdicated, but it did him little good. He and his family were held prisoner and eventually murdered by the Bolsheviks. Naturally, all Russia's enemies wanted to exploit the situation, and the Germans sent an exiled Russian agitator, Lenin, back to his homeland in a sealed train. It was the influence of Lenin and his supporters, the Bolsheviks, which brought about the Russian Revolution. Lenin, whose real name was Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, was the heir to an old tradition in Russia. His intellectual vigor was combined with enthusiasm for violent and radical politics. His party, the Bolsheviks, were able to exploit the widespread war weariness, and they transformed the army into a force for revolution. At midnight on the 7th of November 1917, the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg was stormed and Kerensky's provisional government abruptly collapsed. It was an event which the great Russian filmmaker Sergei Eisenstein celebrated in one of his films. After the revolution, the Bolsheviks controlled the major cities in Russia, but still needed to pacify and gain control of the rural areas and the eastern territories. Meanwhile, the Germans poured into western Russia, setting up new states that were really German satellites in the areas which they conquered. The Russians could not withstand the German onslaught. They fell back and abandoned Poland, the Ukraine, and the Baltic states. By the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918, the Russians made peace with the Germans and abandoned their allies, Britain and France. This allowed the German generals to concentrate on the Western Front, and in March 1918, the Germans advanced urgently to attempt to win the war by a sudden push. Ludendorff's campaign was at first successful. But the Allied defences held, and Ludendorff was not able to break through. Eventually, British and French troops led a successful counterattack. Ludendorff's campaign exhausted German reserves at a time when the Allies had almost unlimited resources. America, a new ally, had entered the war after a long period of hesitation in April 1917. America had decided that it could not afford to let Germany dominate the whole of Europe, and perhaps the whole of Russia as well. The Germans had sunk the Lusitania and other American ships that supplied Great Britain. Now, American ships carried a new American army to stand beside the Canadian, Australian, New Zealand and other Commonwealth troops who had fought bravely throughout the war. Also, by this time, Allied artillery was on a par with German artillery. It was accurate enough to cut barbed wire and empty front-line trenches without making no man's land impassable and warning the enemy exactly where an attack could be expected. By 1918, the war had taken on most of the aspects of modern warfare. Radio and aeroplanes were in use. Tanks were available to batter through defensive structures and lead the way for the infantry. But when the Allies began their final counterattack in October 1918, they had no idea whether Ludendorff's campaign represented his last throw or not. These men had no idea how demoralized Germany had become since Ludendorff's failure. It was only when thousands of German soldiers surrendered and the prisoners began to stream back across no man's land that the impact of the Allied victory became clear. As the trenches were emptied of the wounded and the dead, and the butcher's bill began to be calculated, the impact of this devastating war, the war to end all wars, could be assessed at last. The leaders of the victorious powers assembled at Versailles, near Paris, in January 1919. And it was their intention to reshape Europe entirely according to the interests of the victors. The vanquished were not to be consulted, and when the ceremonious signing of the Treaty of Versailles took place in June 1919, Germany and its allies were forced to accept terms dictated without negotiation. The treaty remade the map of Europe. From Finland in the north to Yugoslavia in the south, a whole swathe of new states was created in Central Europe out of the wreckage of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and from bits of pre-war Russia and Germany. Only the victors were left unscathed. In the Middle East, where war had also raged fiercely for 3 out of the 4 years of the Western Front, European politicians allowed free exercise of their imaginations. The Ottoman Empire had joined forces with Germany, and the Allies had formulated a series of secret agreements designed to dismember it. They had also promised both Arabs and Jews autonomous states, which, like the rest of the Versailles Agreement, were never fully realized. At the same time, the dignitaries in the Palace of Versailles also initiated a war against Bolshevik Russia. Expensive and fragile armored cars and tanks were shipped to Russia to try to suppress the revolutionary government. Scottish, American, French, Japanese, and even German troops took up arms to suppress communism. In the vanguard were the White Russians, and their army was lavishly equipped from the West. Russia was a peasant economy, struggling to reinvent itself after the revolution and the ghastly hardships of the war. Famine, inflation, and economic confusion were part of the legacy which the new communist government had inherited. The Civil War distracted the Bolsheviks from the need to feed their people and forced them to build up an army from the haphazard, ramshackle groups and formations that had achieved the Russian Revolution. In no other way could the revolution be defended against the hammer blows aimed against it by the White Russians and the Western powers in the early 1920s. Lenin died prematurely in 1924. His place was taken by Joseph Stalin, who triumphed over Trotsky and his other rivals. Stalin dominated Russia for 30 years. But at first, during the 20s, Stalin was preoccupied with the struggle to secure Russia's borders, to pacify Russia's racial minorities, and to recapture and pacify the far eastern territories. In America, on the other side of the world, the aftermath of the First World War was a decade of splendid prosperity. It seemed as if America had inherited all the inventiveness and joie de vivre of pre-war Europe. Mack Sennett's bathing bells posed for the cine camera on the beach. Even in the cities there was, or appeared to be, enough for everyone. The 20s was the decade of prohibition, an attempt to suppress the manufacture and consumption of alcohol within America. Prohibition was not to everyone's taste. Economically, America's prosperity was founded on false premises. Manufacturing industry boomed, but interest rates were high, and money was sucked into America and was in short supply elsewhere. The stock exchanges went crazy. The exaggerated strength of the dollar weakened all the other world currencies, until the dollar also plummeted in 1929. American bankers and statesmen had not been ready for the responsibilities forced on them by the First World War, and America's prosperity had terrible consequences elsewhere. In Germany, the main vanquished country, the 20s brought chaos akin to anarchy. The Kaiser had been deposed and a democratic republic had been founded. But people starved, and German currency completely lost its value. The German economy burned itself out with stratospheric inflation. These were the circumstances in the early 20s when Adolf Hitler, helped by conventional German politicians and statesmen, launched his revolutionary National Socialist movement, the Nazis.